Thank you, Claudio. We're very happy to be here today, and we wanted to thank everyone at Art Basel, and in particular, Claudio Vogt for having us. And we're also happy to have so many friends in attendance, and in particular, Martin Hatteboer and Fabienne Abrecht. I will be in conversation, as Claudio said, with Adam Szymczyk, who is the director of the Kunsthalle Basel, as well as Allyson Vieira, who is a New York-based artist and whose show you can see currently at the Swiss Institute until February 2nd, and whose work you've also seen recently at Laurel Gitlin Sculpture Center, Non-Objectif Sud, the Highline, the Public Art Fund. And now I will hand it over to Adam, who will talk a little bit about how the idea for the show with Allyson was initiated at the Kunsthalle Basel.
Thank you, Simon. It's not so much about the idea for this particular show and how it came about, but maybe a little bit about the circumstances in which I met Allyson. I saw her work the first time, and I was very struck by the quality that it had in kind of combining the classical references with the kind of keen interest in exploring possibilities that are inherent to American minimal art. And I thought it was a very untypical work for the time, and I wanted to know more about it. And perhaps a year later, we had another conversation, and then there was a chance to organize a short residency in Basel in an institution in St. Gallen called Zitterberg, that is kind of a sculpture production facility of a professional kind, and they also have a small residency program for artists. And this is where actually the works that we then included in the Plural Present, Allyson's exhibition at the Kunsthalle, which is now on show at the Swiss Institute in New York, all these works were made there in St. Gallen. So somehow we owe the exhibition to this stay of Allyson in Switzerland, and then it's re-entering America through the Swiss institution again. So somehow you became our compatriot. I said our compatriot, although none of us, as we discovered here the backstage while talking before this conversation, is Swiss. So we're not Swiss, but we are kind of trying to, with certain dignity and eagerness, represent Switzerland also here in Miami Beach. So that's roughly the circumstance in which the exhibition came into being, and what we are looking at now is the installation shots of the first iteration of the exhibition at Kunsthalle Basel in the main gallery upstairs.
And I think it's a great expression to use iteration of the exhibition, because as we started talking about bringing the show to New York, we realized that it was not going to be a simple traveling exhibition, but instead a sort of reinvention of what this show could be in the architecture, because Allyson's interest lies in the liminal space between sculpture and architecture. And when we saw the show in Basel in that 19th century building, then it was very obvious that it could not travel to New York, the industrial new era building on Wooster Street, in the very same way. So Allyson completely reinvented the exhibition. And maybe Allyson, you could say a few words about that and about how it's been different for you working in the two different places.
Absolutely. As Adam said, I'm totally indebted to the nation of Switzerland at this point. But so when I first started working on developing the show for Adam, the first thing I asked for were floor plans, because that's usually how I begin thinking about a show, especially when it's such an incredibly beautiful and kind of daunting space as the top floor of the Kunsthalle Basel. I mean, it's really hard to... The architecture in the space itself is so beautiful, so proportional, neoclassical, elegant, that you're like, oh my God, how do I, deal with this as a sculptor? So I looked at the floor plans, and it was a 3-gallery show, and these are images of the main gallery that you'll see here. So I really started thinking about this skylight and the arched ceiling and the really complex crown molding that you can see in these photos, the parquet, oh nice, there we go, just right on cue. The crown molding. And I was thinking, I wanted to do something where there was a real diagonal across the room between these two opposing doors. Anyway, I wanted to really mess with the flow of traffic through the space, but with a way that was transparent, that wasn't magical, that wasn't overly controlling, but was very much there. And so as you can see in this image, the sculptural piece, the giant sculptural piece is called the Long Walls. And I made it from steel studs that you would use to hang sheetrock on. And as you can see in this photo, they go just up exactly to the top of the crown molding. So it's kind of like a contemporary wall in a not so contemporary space that's falling over within there. So the show was really fully conceived in St. Gallen for the Kunsthalle Basel. And then when Simon, seemingly out of the blue, contacted me to move it to the Swiss Institute, of course I said yes. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that one says no to. But then I was immediately struck with fear of how do I take this show that was conceived for this neoclassical space and that was so much about the architecture of the space and put it into a totally different geometry, and with a completely different ceiling, a completely different. It's full of steel girders. It's a beautiful space. It's a redone industrial space. It's elegant, but it doesn't have a kind of classical proportion that the show was based on, and so I had to kind of rethink it and think about the flow of people through the room. And I, instead of creating this S shape that people had to walk through, I tried to create a circuit, because I was looking at the floor plans and looking at the floor plans and looking at the floor plans and trying to think, how do I want to change how people approach this space? How do I want to confuse the natural flow of walking through the space and create my own sight lines through the space, and create a framework to place the sculpture within. And so yeah, I mean, there's these stairways. When we get to the Swiss Institute photos, you'll see there's these strange little staircases. There's a platform. So yeah, there was a certain flexibility there. And I don't know, do you want me to keep going? But yeah, but then there's other installational elements. There's a big camera obscura. There's a video installation, and that is very similar in both of the spaces. That was not so different. But then there were some photographs that were included in the Kunsthalle Basel show that were not included in the Swiss Institute show, and instead, because oftentimes I make works out of the debris that's left over from making another major work, I was able to make new sculptural works for the Swiss Institute with the material debris from the piece that was called the Long Walls in Basel was reconfigured, and it was a new piece called the City Wall in the Swiss Institute. And so all the leftover debris from that went into a piece called Clad Pieces, and these are examples you're seeing right now of Clad Pieces that were made from the remnants of the central sculptural group of the series called Beauty, Mirth, and Abundance. So all of these were made with the detritus that was accumulated during the carving of the figural group that you saw earlier.
Yes, I want to, that's I think about the first time that we see the projection in the second gallery where there was this camera obscura constructed. So like in one room there would be a projection, and in the other room there would be a upside down image appearing after 5 minutes of that same projection in real time. And I wanted to ask you about about the relationship between this classical tradition to which you're very explicitly referring, for instance, by including 2 photographs in the exhibition in Basel that were taken on site at the Olympia temple, at the Zeus temple in Olympia, in Greece, where a close-up on some ancient stones overgrown with moss or grass would be mirrored and flipped upside down and showing a sort of contemporary inverted image. And this on one hand, and on the other hand, the new building that's been constructed at the ground zero. So this is a long span of time between these two locations, but of course one may think about the role of historical monuments and about the destiny of architecture in general. But these are like large qualifiers, and maybe you could say specifically what interests you in like reaching so far back to traditional sculpture and architecture, and at the same time quite aggressively or incisively, you know, biting into contemporary themes, including contemporary political themes.
I think it's easiest to start talking about that if I talk about the form of the photographs and of the camera obscura, and to talk about the idea of the inversion of the image. Maybe that's a good place to start. Can we go back one image? Thank you. So with these images, for me, it's difficult to think about the present time without thinking about both the past and the future simultaneously. I visited Olympia in this past January, so less than a year ago. These were taken then. And I've been to a lot of sites in the ancient world, and there was something really particular about this site where it had been excavated over 100 years ago, maybe about 150 years ago. And you know, it was restored a little bit, but not so much. But one of the interesting things was that now the ground was beginning to come back up over the things that had already been excavated once. And so I felt like there was this idea of objects and time moving forward and backward kind of around the objects. It was just like the accumulation of organic matter, plants taking root there. And so that's these two photos that were in the show. This is plants literally growing back over these ruins again after only 150 years. And so then with the camera obscura piece called Sight, I live like about 9 blocks away from the World Trade Center. So in this piece, I actually moved there. I've lived in New York for a long time, but I moved to this new place about 2 years ago, and I was really struck with seeing the building of this building for every day of my life. And not just that, but seeing the throngs of tourists and having to walk through the throngs of tourists to get along my daily life. So this is a film of a video, it's a 25-minute still shot, and you can see tiny bits of construction happening at the top. It's the building of it, and it's in real time. And in the bottom, there are tourists or just general people, pedestrians, going by. So I was filming here, very clearly filming the building of this building. However, then in the adjacent room, which is identical to the first room, there's a pinhole in the wall. And if you stay in this pitch black room long enough, the image of the building inverted, or image of the video, sorry, it's actually the exact same video, but being played upside down being inverted through physics. It's not being played upside down.
Being projected through a pinhole,
in
the wall connecting to adjoining rooms, and therefore inverted by laws of optics.
Thank you, that was much better. So therefore inverted it. So I was thinking, is this a building? Is it an unbuilding? Is this the past? Is this the future? Which is which? And so when I think of, when I'm inverting these photographs or flipping these photographs, I think about the place before the photographs flip as kind of the 0 point in the timeline. And one way is forward and one way is backward. You kind of think of like an x-axis, and you go into the positive integers and the negative integers. And so a lot of times I have a hard time thinking about objects without thinking about them four-dimensionally. So that's kind of, I think, where this comes from. And I didn't address everything you asked me. Sorry. You want to remind me of the rest of it? I'm sorry.
I just wanted to bring one very powerful trope, which actually appears as a device to speak about the relationship between the past and the present and the future, where where mirror can be used as a kind of see-through device that allows you to kind of see the future or the destination or destiny of certain objects and certain fates, perhaps. And I'm just thinking about this oft-quoted phrase from Nabokov, which is that the future is but the obsolete in reverse. And I guess that there is a lot of this kind of thinking, in bringing this mirror image together simultaneously with the kind of, let's say, original image. Although, what is the original image at this point is under big question mark, because they are somehow reciprocal.
Yeah, exactly. And actually in some earlier works, I've actually literally used mirrors to do this same thing with sculptural pieces, and kind of having a piece pass through, appear to be passing through into the ground, to be completed visually, to create this kind of illusion through very simple means.
Well, that also brings the idea of the runes in reverse, the Smyson expression that's also oft quoted. And to add another quote, I was reading an extract from a lecture that Jean-Luc Nancy gave on Kawara, in which he talked about the present, and it's called the technique of the present. And he said presence is not a quality or a property of the thing. Presence is the act by which the thing is put forward. It is put forward or in front of its nature as a thing, and of everything which immerses this nature in the world of its connections, origins, relations, process, finalities, and becoming. And I thought it resonates very much with a lot of what you did with the exhibition, a lot of your interest in the idea of origins and process and becoming. The origins was the reference to the antique, and the works made from debris, which has to do with process, and the becoming also maybe is a question that arises with the camera obscura, as it is something that reveals itself over time. And I thought it would be interesting to hear you talk about the title of the show, The Plural Present. What did you want to convey with this expression, and what does it mean exactly?
Well, I don't know what it means exactly, but the one thing, a very basic thing about the phrase "the plural present" obviously is that it's a verb tense. It is we, the plural, right, and the present tense. So say we are. And I think that's an important thing, as opposed to it being about the I. I'm not trying to make any kind of grandiose statements about we, but it's a bit more general. But outside of the fact that it's a verb tense, I think about, for me it's when I said this earlier, it's hard for me to think about objects without thinking about them four-dimensionally, and to think about the history of each object and the object form and the materials of that form, the materials that create the form. And that each object has kind of a history of itself, and that each object type has a history of itself. And if we just look around us at the things here, okay, maybe the chair is a very old object type, but maybe the TV monitor isn't so old, and the tripod is actually quite an old object type, and et cetera, et cetera. Some things are new, some things are old, but if we cut through all of those, that's the present. There's some old timelines, some long timelines, there's some very short timelines that have just started. But the plural present perhaps is when we cut through all of those timelines in the moment that's now. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I end up working with history far in the past and then accumulated debris from my own studio pushing through to the future. In a certain way. I mean, that was a stupid way of putting it, I guess, but creating a new material and thinking about things that are being produced now. I didn't make that sculpture, by the way.
The sculpture is cropped in a very interesting way. If it had heads, they would stick out of the picture.
Yes, that's true.
So it's kind of programmed to be shown in this decapitated form. But I wanted to ask you, you're talking about this idea of a cut, which I think can be metonymically understood as the presentness, or the moment of, let's say, presence of things, or where things sort of emerge in their present shape. And I think normally sculpture is not a very natural medium for, dealing with issues of continuity and duration, although it is. And I wanted to ask you, how do you negotiate this let's say, difference, but also certain permeability between the idea of like diachronic and synchronic presence of things within an object. Because I guess the object and also these framed photographs that we saw a while ago, and just flashed through in this flow of images, these are like different devices that you employ in order to kind of probe into the present and to capture it and to pin it down. But then, of course, the paradox appears that the flow or continuity between the past, present, and future, as we learn it, is being somehow interrupted. And this moment of interruption is precisely, I think, where the sculpture emerges. Although I'm a little doubtful about it. So I wanted to ask you inquire a little bit about the way you incorporate process, or whether it's possible to incorporate a process into the physical object, and how this is taking place, let's say, between the clad sculptures on the one hand, but also the moment when you decide to make a print out of this 25-minute projection and sort of perpetuate this work with a Freedom Tower, having a print made of it, which again, like, cuts through the time and selects one instant of that process.
Well, thinking about process and thinking about sculptural process, I do think that sculptures are really good for talking about time, actually. So part of that is that I've had to kind of trick myself. Even though I've always wanted to be a sculptor, I kind of had to trick myself, and I love sculpture. I had to trick myself into doing it, because when I started out, I didn't have a lot of confidence in it. I didn't know how to make things properly. I was always really, really bad in the shop in undergrad. I was really intimidated by it. And then when I was in graduate school, somebody yelled at me in a crit once for not making nice miter joints and something. I was like, oh God, please, And so, but then, after that, I got to the point of being like, no, I really can make this, and I can make something roughly without knowing what the heck I'm doing, as long as I don't, cut my arm off or something. And so I really started embracing a much more physical way of making sculpture. Can we play the slides again? Is that possible? They've gone off. I've kind of embraced a much more physical way of making sculpture, and my works I always leave them really kind of unfinished in a way, and rough, with a lot of process marks, like marks from the process in them, or from the tools and from the pores and things like that. Because in that, it's like seeing a footprint or something, right? You can kind of like, for me at least, it takes me back into the moment of making it, and it seems like something that's kind of fresh. It's not polished out, it's not impermeable, it doesn't look like it's going to last forever. It looks like it might fall down. It won't, but it looks like it might. And so I'm actually thinking about the main sculptural group here, which you can kind of see through the
can we
things there, beauty, mirth, and abundance.
Pictures forward.
Yeah.
And stop. Yeah, no. Go back to things.
Thanks. Yeah.
One more.
The main sculptural group that's made of terracotta bricks it's okay. And then, so, I was working with, I make them, alone. But then all the debris from that, I then collect and made a sequence of these clad sculptures. There were 10 of them in this show, the Basel show, which this image is from. And then I created 3 more at the Swiss Institute, made of debris from other sculptures. And so when I'm making these, I'm really thinking about kind of creating a geology of the moment in the studio. And it's taking all of the kind of extra stuff, the cutoffs, the sweepings, the extra paint, whatever, and mixing it with plaster, making it into a kind of stone or a kind of rock that's carvable, turning it into, like I said, kind of like a studio geology. And it creates kind of like an irrational index of whatever was going on in the studio at that given moment. So all 10 of those were made from debris from this sculpture here. And then I work the surfaces very lightly. I don't really hit them really hard. I put a little hand in there, but like not a lot, because I'm not trying to change them. I'm just trying to like feel my way through whatever the geology is kind of asking for a bit.
So there's this idea of a geology of the exhibition, of an accumulation, imbrication of references, but also there's the idea of the Nachleben der Antike. This is the Warburg quote we talked about earlier, which means the afterlife of the antique, the survival, and in the object you have sort of an immanence of historical references. But on top of these, there's also, I think would be interesting for you to tell us about how these clads are, the proportions of the clads are modeled after the dimensions of your own body, and how that resonates with the history of minimal art and also of post-minimalism. And we sort of the box for standing as a reference in a way.
Yeah. So absolutely. So the dimensions. I only use certain measurements in the work. I really like standard construction dimensions. If anybody has ever built a wall or gone to Home Depot and had to buy material, you know that like in the U.S. you build a wall with a stud at every 16 inches, and your sheetrock comes in 48 by 96 inch sheets, and there's no getting around that. And so I was really interested by this kind of set of measurements that are used to build everything. And so then I kind of took that set of measurements and I kind of stuck my set of measurements into it. And so all of the clads are the exact same height as me, but they're all 16 inches wide, which is the interval that you would place studs at when building a wall, which is also like roughly kind of how wide I am. And I've been actually working with a 16 inch by 64 and a half inches dimension for several years now. It's also the dimension that if I was to make a sculpture of myself, because I'm making materials, right? They're like materials and sculptures kind of at the same time, at least that's the way I think of them. And I think like, okay, so I'm making material that then could potentially be made into a sculpture. So it could potentially be made into a figural sculpture. There are all these kind of verticals. And so if I was going to make a figural sculpture, well, I'm kind of an obvious subject for that sculpture. At first it started, I was making kind of material for figural sculpture, uncarved, and I thought, well, how the heck tall do I make it? And I thought, well, I might as well make it my own height, rather than anyone else's or some idea of average or whatever. But it's kind of taken off since then. And so this sculpture, Beauty, Mirth, and Abundance, which is modeled after the late Roman sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of the Three Graces. They're headless. You saw the image earlier. I've given them a head. But they come up to my shoulder height. So all of these sculptures are human proportioned, and particularly this human, proportioned like this human here. So, did that answer your question well?
Yeah, I think maybe we could talk again a little bit about the camera obscura process and how it was also interesting for you to bring it back to New York. As you said, it's somewhere near where you live, and also how it was to make an artwork that is very much durational, because it cannot only be experienced in a very long duration. Actually, as I came to visit the show, I wasn't able to see it because Adam had the great idea of producing this edition, and it was taking place during a closed day.
Yeah, actually, this edition has really been an incredibly exciting thing to work on. And so in the camera obscura, the video is 25 minutes long and a few seconds. And we created this edition just like one would do with a normal camera obscura, hanging photographic paper with a pinhole camera, except we were actually able to produce an actual edition because the thing that was being projected was a video and it was fixed. It wasn't like doing it, out your window or of a busy intersection, which you will never have the same thing twice. We literally had the same thing 25 times or however many times we did it. And then came up the question of how do I title this piece? How do I title this edition? And I struggled with titling this edition. And then I realized why I was struggling so hard, and it was because I saw the edition literally as the same piece as the camera obscura, because it held absolutely every piece of information, at least every piece of image. Not every piece of information, because of course there's the physical information of the two rooms and the experiential information, but it held every single pixel of the image from 25 minutes. as the video did. And so I ended up just titling it the same thing. So that was really an exciting thing for me to realize that, because I never made photo before. And actually, one of the things you were talking about with process and sculpture, I kind of just end up throwing myself into these processes that I don't understand. And that's been something exciting to learn how to do. And right now I'm throwing myself into some strange photo places because I've never made photos before. And it's kind of exciting to do it in a way that maybe somebody who knew about photo wouldn't do. And that's kind of how I've made sculpture always. Like, if somebody knew about sculpture, they wouldn't necessarily make it like this.
Well, circling back about that idea of throwing yourself into media you don't know so much, can you explain a little bit more about this new photo series you're doing with where you're merging the digital and the analog, the most analog and the most digital in a way with the computer prints?
Right. So it's actually inspired by the Camera Obscura prints, the edition that we did. But yeah, I was like, after I thought about doing that, I thought, wow, I can actually do a lot more with this. And I've been making, I don't even know, I'm so stupid about photo, I don't even know the right words to use. That's the embarrassing part. But I've been making these exposures, I guess you'd call it, directly from my laptop screen onto photo paper. And that's been a really exciting thing. But thinking about, always from videos, and thinking about duration, and how do I include a certain amount of duration onto a piece of photo paper. How many ND filters, I mean, this is technical, but like how many ND filters do I have to put down on the screen in order to have an exposure of a certain length? And then all the weird surprises that happen when you do that. And that's been the exciting part of working like that. Just like, wow, I didn't know it would be blue or something, I didn't know it would be ochre. So that's been kind of a really exciting place that I've been working in lately. Yeah, all inspired by the Camera Obscura print.
I wanted to go back a little bit to your discussion of material in the sculpture, because on the one hand you do get involved with some more conventional or classical sculptural materials. On the other hand, there's the industrial part, both in the choice of material and in the type of process that you're interested in. So my question is about the kind of possible relationship between this kind of skilled and completely disskilled type of work that, the former is the one that the sculptor used to involve through the academic tradition that begins with a kind of classical ideal, and the other is the kind of rejection of the skilled production, which most notably, of course, did happen in American minimal art, but also one could go back a little earlier, and I think this is not an irrelevant example of Russian constructivism, and especially Tatlin and his counter-reliefs, which are more like accumulations of different materials. So could you perhaps describe this field of materials that you're plundering with your work?
I'm plundering. I've just been told that we have 5 minutes. That's why I was making faces over there. I'm sorry, Anna. So I'm going to answer it really quickly, and then maybe we can take a question. I worked with plaster a lot at first, because plaster was kind of the material of three-dimensional replication and the dissemination of classical imagery throughout Western Europe, and so I really became interested in that. But then I've started recently working with construction materials almost exclusively at this point. And when I think about classical architecture, I think about the architecture, not even classical, but just old ruins, old things that still exist, objects that have a long timeline. They're mostly made of stone, and the same stone that the sculptures are made out of. So we have this like continuity of material between architecture and sculpture that doesn't necessarily exist anymore. And so I've been interested in trying to use contemporary architectural materials to make sculpture. I mean, that's really in a nutshell. But and in terms of And then it's like, well, what can you do with it? I mean, there's not a lot of, and tried to use contemporary construction materials to make like semi-classical sculptures, which has been kind of fun and exciting, and I never really know what it's going to end up looking like before I start. Should we take a question, if there's any? If there's any.
I have a question for Mr. Szymczyk. We are here in Miami, supposedly at the most important art fair of the Western Hemisphere. You have just been named the curator of Documenta in Kassel 2017. Could you please, just in a nutshell, compare the two? Are there any pieces of art or any elements of Art Basel that you might consider presenting in Documenta?
Well, for the purpose of this talk, and this is not intended as a kind of in any way disrespectful or dismissive reaction to your question, I decided not to address the issues of Documenta, because this is a conversation that has to do with Allyson's recent 2 exhibitions at Kunsthalle Basel and Swiss Institute, and therefore I'll be extremely happy to take any questions with regard to Documenta in circumstances that are proper to it. Thank you.
Allyson, can I ask you a question? Thanks. Sorry. Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Your work is so precise and, if I may say so, calculated. And how much, though, are you looking for the coincidence? You started touching on it through using materials you don't know about.
I'm flattered that you say that, because I don't necessarily see it that way. I think in these pieces, in the city walls here that you see, of course, it's quite calculated, but in a very basic way, it's just a grid. I mean, it's not like, this isn't, aerospace engineering or something. It's just wall building. And so that part, of course, has to be fairly well done. But honestly, with the sculptural work, it's not. I don't mean to disappoint, but it's really not. I kind of just throw myself at it a bit. Thanks, Fabienne.
Oh, you said you wanted to let it collapse the way it wants to collapse.
Yeah, and I let it collapse the way it wants to collapse, exactly. So that should be...
Where's Claudio to tell me to stop?
Claudio.
Claudia?
Claudio is disappearing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks.